I'm going to go ahead and call this regular Assembly Committee meeting on homelessness to order. Let's go ahead and start with introductions. I'm starting at this side of the table.
Doug Lanskin.
Greg Dyson.
Suzanne France.
Eric Croft. Christopher Constant.
Felix Rivera.
Jake Trainee. Tim Stamp.
Forrest Dunbar.
Pete Peterson.
Becky McPherson, Municipal Attorney. Nancy Burke, Mayor's Office.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's go ahead and go on to our busy business schedule, starting with the Mayor's Housing and Homeless Services Coordination Update.
Thank you. I have provided a written report. I know our agenda today is very full, and we have broader conversations to have than just the initiative report. So I've provided you with a written document, as well as the first item in my written update is about the Anchorage Community Plan to End Homelessness. We've been discussing the effort to consolidate the efforts of several different entities working in and around homelessness in the community. The Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness is leading that effort. And on a meeting, February 23rd was the first meeting. It was a broadening of the voices coming to the table to talk about homelessness in our community plan. It included community councils, business members, homeless providers, state representatives, and it was a very nice broadening of the work. May 11th was the second date for that meeting. We had another great turnout of individuals interested in this conversation. There is a draft plan that is the consolidation and strategic action plan that I've provided to you. It is not complete. It's in the process of receiving input from members of the community and some key stakeholders that the core planning team is reaching out to. So this document is provided to you for review and input if you'd like to contact me individually, or we can hold a session if that would be desirable around it. And then at our meeting in June, I would like to request the permission of the chair to provide an updated, a deeper report on that document. Other activities you can read. We're very thankful for approval of a couple of contracts that went through the assembly process, and we are able to get consultants on board to help us begin the feasibility planning for the Alaska Center for Treatment, which is the rebuild of our treatment facilities located out near Point Lawrence. We're very pleased to be working with a national consultant who's been doing consulting work with the State Division of Behavioral Health in the Department of Health and Social Services, Stephanie Colston, and she is a recognized leader in substance use treatment areas. She's going to help us evaluate all of the resources in the community and come up with recommendations on what types of services may be co-located or housed in the location near Point Lawrence. So I'm very excited about that. That will pick up pretty fully in June. I think Ms. Holston is going to be able to make a trip up here in June to visit with us. Other activities we'll be discussing today, some information around the camp process and the work we're doing in that area. The mobile intervention team continues to develop procedures and to work with key partners on the needs of people with high behavioral health conditions in the community. And I think with that, Mr. Chair, I will let the committee review the rest of the report and conclude my report.
Okay, thank you so much. Any questions for Ms. Burke on her report? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on with our agenda. I do want to add one additional item. My apologies, forgot to get this on. Just a quick overview and discussion of a resolution that was just passed out to the members of the committee. So we will do that if time permits at the end, which I hope it does. Moving on then, an overview of the community dashboard.
That I think if we one
To
for
June?
June and ask
Sure.
the committee to review it and
Sure.
to contact me or to request a session on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this committee will be interested in having that before us in June. So then a discussion on volunteer organizations participating in camp abatement. This was an agenda item that had been expressed to me over email by one of the members that they wanted to discuss with this committee. So if I can, I will go ahead and have our municipal attorney begin the discussion, unless an assembly member has any particular points or questions. Yes, Mr. Dyson.
I'm sorry, repeat what you said, just said.
Yeah, so this particular discussion item was one that one of the members of this committee had wanted on the agenda. So I have our municipal attorney here to discuss, which is volunteer organizations participating in camp abatement.
Yeah, I'm sorry, okay,
Yeah,
forgive me.
I'll go ahead and turn it over to our municipal attorney.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, I would say the ordinance on this item was drafted by Mr. Gates, so anytime he wants to jump in, I certainly welcome his comments and input. Sort of an initial matter of the structure regarding use of volunteers and abatement. Our code does state that volunteers may legally be used in any type of camp abatement. The municipal official, abatement needs to be led by a municipal official. When I say abatement, I mean removal of a camp where there may still be residents living. The municipal official responsible for the abatement under code may accomplish the abatement with the assistance of a contractor, association, or organization. Volunteers may not themselves abate camps in which people are living. That is not provided for by law. I would say I do have some liability concerns, legal liability concerns about the use of volunteer groups in the abatement of camps where there may still be residents living. Specifically concerning volunteer safety, if we are leading a volunteer group, because they need to be under the supervision of a municipal official if they are participating in a camp abatement that involves residents still living in the camp or individuals still living in the camp. Camp resident safety, and then I have some concerns about due process. We, by law, follow a very set process for how we remove camps, especially camps that involve, particularly camps that involve individuals who are still living there, required by the Constitution to protect the individuals who are being removed from being separated from personal property. And again, has a very specific choreography, and so to the extent we involve untrained individuals who are not municipal officials, I have some concerns about that. I would say there's certainly a significantly less legal concern about the involvement of volunteers in the removal of camps that we know are abandoned. And to this, I would say I understand we do have excess liability insurance coverage, which covers those volunteers if they are part of a crew led by a municipal employee. We have in the past, I understand, obtained legal waivers from individuals as part of this, which is also a required piece of that process. And then I'd also add that the code does permit anyone to clean up garbage, litter, waste, or other unsanitary or hazardous conditions on public land at any time that the public land is open to the public. So in our parks, volunteers may at any time remove garbage, litter, or waste, or other unsanitary or hazardous conditions, with the caveat that they should be careful not to remove things that are personal property of any individual who may be engaged in illegal camping. So this is a rough the summary, and then if there are any specific questions, we certainly can answer those.
Thank you. Mr. Trainee.
Municipal official, is that also defined as an assembly member? Because we may have some assembly members out there helping. I want to know if they are in fact considered by your organization legal to be a municipal official.
I'm not sure if municipal official is actually defined in Title 15. Mr. Gates may know more specifically than I do because he was the drafter of this language, but I can certainly check if municipal official is specifically defined. I understand that generally a municipal official, these abatements are led by community work service, which is again trained in the code required process for abatement of an camp.
If I may add, assembly members, we're the legislative branch, the executive branch administers and carries out our laws. I would really discourage assembly members from trying to take the lead. I've heard about campsite abatement cleanups. They talk about a municipal official who's responsible for this site abatement. I don't think it would be wise to, although maybe it's not explicitly stated that an assembly member couldn't be that municipal official. I wouldn't want one to be, but I don't see any issue. I think with an assembly member wanting to participate in the cleanup, just not be that lead municipal official who's directing the effort, which is mostly an executive branch, essentially.
I would agree with that conclusion. I've just had a chance to search the code. There isn't a specific definition, but I'd agree with Mr. Gates.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chris.
I
That was for
think
you.
we have to be careful. I mean, it's great to
I'm
have
not sure.
volunteers. I know a lot of people have a lot of enthusiasm out there.
I don't want to get hung out there.
But if a volunteer goes out and starts removing things from a camp, and he's not there with some sort of municipal official or law enforcement or something, and then the camper comes back, we could have a confrontation that could not turn out well. So I think we have to make sure that we don't try to get too many volunteers out there on their own. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Good points. Mr. Dyson.
Thanks. A quick question you've covered before, but why can't we immediately evict somebody camping on a city park that's widely used every day?
Well, and again, Mr. Gates litigated this question. The most direct answer is we have a binding decision of the Alaska court of our Superior Court that precludes us from immediately abating on constitutional grounds. That we need to provide notice and an opportunity to be heard in due process before we potentially separate an individual from their personal property.
Was that a city? Excuse me. Was that a court decision about the muni?
Yes.
Did we ever consider appealing that?
I'll defer to Mr. Gates because again, he litigated the issue.
We did not ask to appeal that case. We had some discussion about appeal about municipal attorney's office at that time, and the administration decided not to appeal. Instead, we opted to draft amendments to fix out the ordinance that were in compliance with the court's decision. So, and that was basically changed from 5 business days, 5 calendar days, notice to 15, which is now changed to 10. But that was immediately after the case and the decision not to appeal.
Is there a statute of limitations on how soon you have to file an appeal?
Yes, there is.
Okay.
And it's long past.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Constant.
Yeah, thanks. Briefly on that point, Mr. Dyson, I think the slow roll of the people who filed the previous litigation is because no one knows how this will come out, right, if it were to be relitigated. And the muni's done a lot of work to mitigate the threats that we had to deal with back then, so it's a whole different climate. So it's a very interesting question. But I want to talk more about the process now. So what I just heard is that, in fact, we aren't coming up with a new process that is explicit that states volunteer groups will not be participating in abatement. So, and that's, okay, great. I understand that there is a problem with how things happened before on the previous cleanup for lack of communication and coordination. It seems like we would be wise to provide a broad training for people who will be cleaning up in the camps so that we can kind of pre-certify people to be knowledgeable. And then if they don't follow the rules, then it's a little bit less our responsibility, or we can at least say you need to follow the rules that you said you would follow. And what I'm very hesitant to see us do is say we are restricting the ability of volunteers to organize with a municipal official to do this. So we don't do that. And then at the same time not do the abatements in a timely manner. So, because if we get in a situation where we have certain areas where we're effectively not abating, we might even be citing, posting, but not ever getting to it, then we create a climate in which the people who are living in the camps believe that they have a right to be there beyond the terms, and they'll never be abated, so they wouldn't leave, even if they were told they had to leave, right? And so I'm hopeful that whatever process emerges from this conversation in the end, even if it is more restrictive of neighbors participating in structured cleanups and abatements, that it's followed with a more structured process for abating, so that they can come in as volunteers and clean up without people there, right? And so that comes to the idea of the conversation that I've heard in several corners about changing municipal code to allow for zoned abatements, zone area abatements, as opposed to tent-specific abatements where we post in a general area at a certain time, and at a time-specific point after that point, it doesn't matter if you moved in a day before, that everything has to go that's in that area. It was properly noticed this is coming. And so I'm hopeful that we can move the conversation along on that line, move the conversation along the lines of having a fair process for notification and cleanup that we generally stick to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Steele.
Yeah, don't we have signs along the coastal trail and in the parks that say no overnight use or no camping? So isn't that noticed?
I believe so. I defer to, I believe I saw Mr. Roddick, and then I think he knows better than I do what type of signage we have in our municipal parks. For the legal question, there is a provision in our code that states that if an area is clearly signed for no trespassing or camping, then we can abate more quickly. The challenge there from the legal research we've done is making sure that the signage we have actually provides that notice. I mean, I think we have signage that's at like the used trailhead, but if someone enters the woods from another location, then we have not potentially effectively provided the notice we're legally required to, so that becomes the logistical challenge. It certainly doesn't foreclose us from exploring the option further, but we would have to make sure we're actually really giving people notice that the area's been posted. But I would defer to Mr. Rod if you have information on what type of signs we do have at this point.
We do have signs everywhere. Not literally everywhere, but close now. That has the language made it enforceable by the police department. It doesn't spell out no camping, no fires, et cetera, and code provision across the bottom, so the citation can address that specifically. But that doesn't stop the activity.
Anything further, Mr. Steele?
Yeah, it just seems to me that it would make prosecution possible, but then you're going down another rabbit hole somewhere. So we need to build up the habits of camping.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Mr. Gates, did you want to add anything?
I was just going to mention something. Mr. Constance's comment about a zoned campsite being in a small area. The concept's been applied. I think a few weeks ago there were like 7 campsites in one small area that were abated, and that's in theory a zoned type of abatement. And back in 2009, 2010, when we first enacted the single campsite abatement ordinance, EPD went out and cleaned up a series of campsites that were across the fence from Tyson Elementary School in the Mountain View area. So, but they did post each campsite individually as well. So I think that zone abatement is, it's not a foreign concept, but it takes, I think, logistical effort to make sure it works and that it's done properly, the right due process for people.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Mr. Constant.
Yeah, to that point, Dean, I think that the challenge is when you have posted an area that had 7 tents, and then 5 days later, 2 more tents show up. They weren't posted. And so then your abatement crew comes through, but then they're going to have to leave because they weren't properly noticed. And so then those 2 screw up the whole process for everybody. And we're coming up with an alternative that allows a clear posting around a certain area at a certain time that then doesn't matter who came in today, tomorrow, or next week, we can abate is the method I'm hoping we can investigate.
Yes.
To that point, I think the real issue is I think we have to just look at potentially amending 1520-220B15A, which specifically states that posting is supposed to be on each tent, hut, lean-to, or other shelter designated for removal, or if no structure or shelter exists, affixed in a conspicuous place near the bedding, cooking site, or other personal property. So we just have to look at a tweak to that language to change where the notice is required to be posted.
and if I might, I think that's an excellent opportunity for us to investigate tightening up the process, recognizing that we can't just go and post everywhere in Anchorage all over all at once, creating a de facto no camp zone for individuals, because if we're displacing people, even if the intent is simply to clean the land and take away the harms that have been done, the needles and the human waste and all that, in a short-term sense, then we still have to have a place for people to go. And so that's the constraining variable, if you will, is we need to be able to provide hospitable environments for people to continue surviving. So while we clean up the places that have been kind of poisoned.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, this is all fascinating, and I appreciate you probably want to get on the other testifiers. But is there something special about municipal property in the urban area? I mean, if somebody started camping in DOT's right away alongside of the highway, or in MLMP's near a switch yard, would we have the same difficulty in running them off?
Certainly we would, and we actually, I mean, again, I would defer for specifics to Mr. Rob who oversees this, but my understanding is we actually do conduct abatements in DOT rights of way and in property owned by other municipal entities other than Parks and Rec as well. This applies to all public property.
Yeah, so just finish. Our responsibility to protect the public. I'm thinking about kids that are playing in Valley of the Moon Park and get molested or kidnapped or whatever. You know, that responsibility just would incline me to push the legal case, and so that we can, on a selected basis, public park where kids are playing, we ought to be able to preemptively 86 everybody, that stays overnight. I'm not even good at what I do, let alone knowing what's good at what you do, but it just, I don't know a cogent argument.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Yes, Mr. Gates.
I'd just like to mention that there's an exception in ordinance 2020 and 15G has a list of exceptions. One of them is when the where exigent circumstances posing a serious risk to human life and safety exist, the abatement wouldn't be a faster process. But you still need to respect the personal property and store personal property. That's of value to the owner. So, and then again, that's exigent circumstances and a serious risk. So if you're talking about a DOT right of way, maybe if you're talking about trucks, train tracks, I mean, clearly an exigent circumstance. If you're camped 50 feet away but within the right of way, maybe that's not such an exigent circumstance.
Okay.
Just one last note of color for that, and that is at the cleanup that happened on Citywide Cleanup Day, the group that did the work, I mostly just observed, but removed 6 giant dump trucks full of waste, and 6 small truckloads of personal property was secured by the individuals and moved to a separate location. So effectively, several tons of personal property were retrieved, and many tons of waste were removed. So that's kind of the issue we're looking at.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. So moving on in our agenda, this is another item at the last assembly meeting. Several of my colleagues wanted to discuss the discussion on the map of illegal campsites, and I will go ahead and turn it again to our municipal attorney to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the question was posed in our office of what types of information that we have regarding homeless camps is public information that could be shared, and what types of information we have is protected by law as private information. And so my understanding, and I digging into this through our office, is that we have essentially 3 different types of information regarding camps rolled together. And I apologize if I'm repeating information you already know, but we have information generated by the public where and in those instances, who make a report of an illegal campsite, and in that instance, the identity of the person making the report is protected by law because it is a report of a code violation. So under 390, we cannot disclose the person who made the report, but the information they submit about the location of the camp. I don't see anything in law that makes that private information. I believe that's public information. We then have information. We have reports showing camps that are tagged for abatement. Under our Title 15, our illegal camping ordinance links to and relies upon our criminal code, Title 8. So those reports of camp being tagged as an illegal camp are generated by APD as a criminal record. They are the beginning of a criminal investigation that is then closed out when the camp is abated and people are arrested for trespass, or they're not because they depart voluntarily. I believe I understand there are also other types of records generated by APD as part of their posting, including the identity of individuals located on site, whether they're outstanding warrants, et cetera. I think, while I believe there's some portion of that information that could be released publicly, but it certainly can't wholesale. We can't, there are a number of elements of that are either an active criminal investigation can't be disclosed until after the investigation is closed out, or otherwise protected as police records. And then I understand there's a layer of data that's created by Nancy's team, which includes, in concert with DHHS, which includes heart forms and information gathered about the types of mental health and physical health services that may be required by individuals living in camps. And that information is private information under state and local law, and potentially also under federal law under HIPAA. So my understanding is that the practical problem of kind of why can't we just throw open the gates and allow the public into our existing system is that the existing system is an amalgamation of these types of information, much of which is protected by law. We can, and we certainly will respond to public records requests, and we can extract out the pieces that are public. I think we could, and the City of Portland has created a map that's entirely sourced from public reports of homeless camp locations. I think that is something that would pass legal muster. We could potentially, we could disclose the location of camps where abatements have been completed. That is also, once the abatement is completed, that's no longer protected information. And I think as a final point, I've heard a number of questions of why is this different from, like, we can disclose name and address information, and we do through our land records database. The difference is what I've already gone through, which is the source of the data, because most of the data that we have is gathered either by APD as part of what is at the time a criminal investigation, or gathered through DHHS as part of work to provide health services. It becomes protected in a different way than information you might give to the recorder's office when you purchase a property. Could we gather information in a different way and make it public potentially? I think in the end it's a resource and policy decision for this body about whether or not that's what resources we want to allocate to this type of information and whether it's useful. And then I understand there are other policy concerns about safety issues if we do have camp locations posted in a centrally accessible area. So again, I think that piece comes down to a policy decision.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Costa.
Thanks. Now, I don't know, several people have asked for a map. I have seen a map before that was presented to the body that didn't have a ton of specific information. It certainly didn't identify criminals that might have been found at the site, or alleged criminals, or anything like that. And I understand the APD's updated crime map that shows you everything that's going on is made generalized in such a way that it's by block or by area, not specific to an address, so that you aren't violating the privacy of others. And it seems like that we could do that. We could come up with a system, but I guess it really depends on what your purpose is for having the map, right? Because then that's what you're going to demand the specificity of information for, right? But a map that shows posted and abated and cleaned is probably pretty helpful for people to see progress. Maybe even if it's just time every quarter, once a month or something, updated so the public can see the progress of the cleanup opportunities that are going on, might be helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. And that might be an interesting part to put into the community dashboard, if that has been thought of, Ms. Burke, to sort of give the community an update of how here's the abatement process, cleanup process, here's how it's going throughout the community. All right, any other questions on this particular subject? Yes, Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not so much a question about the map, but just to the point that Mr. Constant raised about displacement and when the camps are abated, you know, where do these folks go? We know that in some cases people just move their belongings a couple blocks away, and once the team is gone, move back. They're still, as Mr. Constant pointed out, a benefit to removing sharps and waste and, you know, other garbage from the site, even if when those camps go back. And I guess my question would be to Ms. Burke, do we see that the camp abatement process is a trigger for getting folks into service or into services or into that coordinated entry, or is it just something that, you know, runs parallel as a separate process in our attempt to move folks out of parks?
It is an intervention point. There are some challenges with the connection to the coordinated entry system that we're addressing with our partners at the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. But generally, that is the intervention point we're aiming for. We want to use that opportunity to do two things. One, to begin establishing relationships, because people are suspicious in the camps. They've been moved or had negative interactions quite a bit. So to begin that relationship establishment. And then two, to motivate them to access services, to be on the coordinated entry list, to connect with a social service provider, to make that intervention. We are seeing a trend where tutor seems to be something of a dividing line in the community. People who are north of tutor tend to be connecting with services a little more frequently and have more likelihood of being on the coordinated entry list. People south of Tudor are not, we're not seeing that connection and interaction, so that's a focus for our outreach work.
Yes.
Do you know why that might be, why folks south of Tudor are more likely to receive services?
It's generally been the case in this community that people south of Tudor are those who are do less well in high volume areas, and they're generally trying to get to locations where they're more isolated and don't interact with a lot of people, and then people who will access services south of Tudor, or north of Tudor, excuse me, are generally more able to interact in higher volume areas, kind of thing.
All right, thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Any other questions? Sure, Mr. Constant.
You know, after the cleanup, Nancy and I talked a bit about that intervention point, and it's probably good for us to talk about that a little bit publicly. That, because I asked the question, where were the social workers when this whole thing was going down? And there's a theory of which that's a good point to intervene. And then there's another theory that says you want to intervene before that with them, with your social workers, and after that, but not at that point, because you don't want to break the trust you've been building. And I think that that's an interesting part of the conversation to understand on the different philosophies of what we're approaching here. And because the moment is traumatic in every direction. And so when is the moment when the best good can be accomplished? And I would suggest, Nancy's probably right, hear me say that in public a couple times, but the way that we can write it down, the way that we get there is probably more mobile intervention team. And so I've asked Nancy to investigate what it would take to double that team, so it's 6 or 7 days a week and not just 3 days a week as it's currently operating. Because if we are going to send point people out to intervene and provide options and funnel these interventions through a system that works, we need to lead it. And so, anyhow, I've asked Nancy to kind of look at what that would cost and how that would work.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. All right, so moving on in our agenda to the added item. So I just want to provide a quick overview of a resolution which Ms. LaFrance and I put together. I'll read the title and just quickly give a summary of the whereases, and I'll read the last resolve statement. So this is a resolution of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly declaring a policy of scattered site placement in the Anchorage Bowl of services and programs for homeless persons. The administration, I will continue to work with them to update this, but it's come to my understanding that scattered site has a very specific term in this work, so I'll be changing that. Basically, what Ms. LaFrance and I are trying to say is these services will be dispersed throughout the community. So this first whereas talks about the past and the policy of the municipality to concentrate many of these services in the East Downtown and North Fairview areas. The second and third whereas talks about some of the specifics of the different services in the East Downtown and North Fairview areas. The fourth whereas talks about the number of emergency overnight shelter beds. The next whereas gives, I think, an important point that Mr. Constant has raised many times in the past, talking about 82% of the municipality's emergency overnight shelter beds being placed in the East Downtown and North Fairview areas, on top of several other projects. The next whereas talks about the shelter system and some of the issues in the East Downtown and North Fairview areas, not just for the population experiencing homelessness, but for those who live around these services. And then the last whereas talks about the current administration and the many strides that they have made to decentralize some of these services. And I'll quickly read the last resolve statements. So the Anchorage Assembly resolves and declares it a public policy of the municipality to, when it has the opportunity to do so, locate or recommend sites dispersed throughout all areas of the Anchorage Bowl for new or relocated sites for programs and services providing core and essential services for those experiencing homelessness, including shelters, transitional, supportive, or affordable housing units, medical care, and mental health care, in order to, in the long term, create dispersed placement and less concentration and density of such services in the downtown and Fairview areas as compared to the rest of the Anchorage Bowl. So our intent is to have this continue working with legal and with Ms. Burke and the administration, fine-tune this, have this put on the addendum, and I will leave it up to the body whether we feel this is an important enough policy point to have a public hearing and allow the public to weigh in at a formal public hearing before the Assembly. With that, I'll open it up to questions and thoughts. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you. A couple of questions. So for the attorneys, and I always get a little bit confused about different kinds of resolutions that we have. What legal effect will this have exactly?
That's a good question. I think, I think it sets the will of the Assembly. I don't know that what would happen if the administration elected not follow it, but it does set a legal direction for how you'd like policy to proceed, and you certainly have the power yourselves to, if you feel the policy is not following this resolution that you've set, to examine elements of the municipal code and amend accordingly. So I think that's probably how it would be enforced if you're going to get into that question. But I think it's more of a statement, a vision statement for where you'd like policy to go.
Mr. Gates, you have anything to add to that?
Well, I would agree with Ms. Wynn-Pearson. I think that an ordinance has more the force of law, where Mr. Father says empowerment, it's force of law. A resolution is like you said, the will of this body, and you establish public policy. The administration doesn't follow what the Assembly does, declares a public policy. Then we're going to have some tension between these two branches of our government. How that would play out, I guess, I don't know. You could see it play out a number of different ways. This does have, I think, some definitely a persuasive effect in terms of how, I guess, homelessness should be addressed and services and housing options should be implemented going forward. So it definitely has an important legal persuasive effect, but not the same as an ordinance.
Yeah, I would add, I think in some ways it's simply a notice providing vehicle, because a lot of the actual practical things that will happen can make this happen will come back before the assembly. If we're spending money to build a new facility, or we're leasing land to a service provider, those decisions will come back before this body. And I feel like essentially this is you giving notice to members of the administration who might bring those decisions to this body, that those things that don't comply with this policy may not pass if they're presented to the body.
If I could make a comparison, we've got our land use plans, right, in the Title 21 comprehensive plan with all these different elements. If someone wants to rezone property, it needs to be consistent with that plan. So that's more of a guide, and it has real effect on what people can do with their planning development and so forth. This doesn't have the same effect as a land use plan, but it certainly has an effect on future planning and how it should take place. It doesn't have the same as directory and mandatory, let's do this effect. I don't want to water this down. It's very important. Public policy is very important. And the Assembly establishes public policy. I would say, I think, if in the future at some point we're in court, someone can make an argument based on public policy, and the policy is often part of constitutional arguments. This could be put out there saying, well, the municipality said this is our policy. So it does have its place in law.
Can I ask a follow-up to that for the sponsors of the ordinance, then the resolution, getting to some of the content here. So I'm curious, so looking at what we actually resolved to set as a public policy, and I'm very supportive of the notion of scattered site housing, but so it states for those experiencing homelessness at the very bottom of the page, and on the other side it says things like affordable housing units, medical care, mental health care. So I guess the question is really, how do we know exactly when a project is for those experiencing homelessness? So, Mr. Constant often makes the point that everything is concentrated in his area in Fairview. But the truth is, actually, in East Anchorage, we've had a very large expansion of affordable housing units. But they're in mixed developments, where you have some units that are affordable and some that are market rate. Are we stating a policy that we don't want to build mixed rate or market rate and affordable projects in Fairview and East Downtown? Is that our policy? And then, like medical care, for example, we have medical facilities, but I think relatively few of them are set up just for people experiencing homelessness. We have a doctor's office or an emergency room that serves a variety of people. Would that also violate this policy if those kind of facilities were planned for East Downtown and Fairview? So that's my question for the sponsors.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think, our intent definitely isn't to stop positive development in the Fairview and East Downtown areas, but I think one of the things that I know Mr. Constant has said a lot in the past is if you follow the money that is being spent in homelessness, and I think for some of these it would be pretty easy to follow the money. You do raise a good points in terms of medical care and mental health care, but for most of these it's pretty easy to follow the money and say these units, scattered site units, all being funded by organizations working with those experiencing homelessness, and you can say here's the proportionate effect in the East Downtown and Fairview area versus the rest of the bowl based on the money being spent.
So just a follow-up to that, if I might, very quickly. So Cook Inlet Housing Authority is now a partner in our Pathway to Success program.
Yes.
Like I said, they've built several very large developments in East Anchorage, which I personally welcome. They're a combination of senior and affordable housing. Is it the policy then of the Assembly, if we pass this, that Cook Inlet Housing Authority projects are no longer welcome in East Anchorage, East Downtown, and Fairview. Because the term affordable housing unit is specifically in this resolution.
I might add just a brief clarifying point.
Sure.
That when I have talked about these issues in the past, I have really focused on government subsidized funding, right? Government investment. And so that it would behoove us to be wise about where we put our money, because where we put our money is where everything goes. And so when I think about these things, I don't think about a private clinic wanting to open up with their dollars to do their independent business as they have a by right to do. I'm talking about where we're incentivizing and how we're utilizing the power of government resources to create movement and create change and create concrete policies and concrete kind of construction. So I think that while it's an interesting thing to think of this set policy that says no affordable housing to be built in the downtown, I don't think it does that. But what I think it does, or can be clarified to do, is express, and I'm not the author of this, I haven't had anything to do with this, today is the first time I've seen this, that it would be wise to clarify that the subsidies are the thing that we should be very careful with.
Well, I mean, Cook Inlet Housing Authority is pretty heavily subsidized by federal funds, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, Ms. Burke, I'm actually not totally familiar with where Cook Inlet Housing Authority's funding come from.
Yeah.
But is that the case?
It's absolutely true. But again, it's a matter of percentages, volumes, it's all of it, not just the nice mixed use, some units that are subsidized affordable housing, it's every single unit, compounding.
But the way this resolution
One
says
time.
that affordable housing units for people experiencing homelessness are no longer welcome in this part of town.
It doesn't say that.
Yeah, I think we have different readings here of what this resolution says. So to give sort of a practical view of how this resolution might be used, if the assembly were appropriating money, pass-through money from HUD, let's say, and that project in that appropriation was specifically for this area, and the intent was to provide services for those experiencing homelessness, that would be a red flag for us. Is this adding to the concentration in the East Downtown and North Fairview areas? So that creates a red flag, and then it's up to this body to determine whether we are adding to the propensity of services and some of the other issues that have been layered over the years in these areas, or shall we as a body say, let's look seriously at other parts of town to see if this project is viable in other parts of town? Ms. Frick.
A piece of this topic was addressed when I started working on a way to sort of lay out. There was a request early in my work about laying out where services were located, and the thought was maybe put in where housing that used the city's dollars went. And I specifically had a couple of housing providers approach me and say, if you start labeling things that way, we will not be partnering. We will not be, the perception of a negative connotation with that kind of a mapping or view has to be approached very carefully. And instead, one of the ways that I started thinking about it was, why not approach it through incentivizing, if you want a distribution, incentivizing it in different areas by saying we would add additional perks, tax reduction, or, the muni has several tools that could be used to add to development to create the kind of community-wide access to these services that is needed. That's right.
Felix? Mm-hmm. So would then a second be it resolved that we would direct the administration to craft a policy of incentives be something that would be meeting that point?
Mr. Gates.
Yeah, I just wanted a little clarifying points on some language. So Mr. Constant was talking about private development. The municipality doesn't have a part of the Point they have a project that fits in these categories. And I assisted Mr. Rivera's friends in drafting this resolution, and some language I chose was intended to address that. If you look at line 43 on page 3, it says the municipality has the opportunity to do so, locate or recommend sites. So with the municipalities, it's our project, we can locate a site and decide where it's going to locate. It's not ours. I think in most instances, we planning it the road and safety department. There's an application and there's a project. You have an opportunity to recommend placing this somewhere else. So that was intended to address project development. We don't have any control over it, but we make recommendations. So that's why I chose that language here particularly. And then I see that in some other portions of the resolution, some language choices perhaps we can make out.
Felix? Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Constable.
Maybe then also to address some of the concern that I heard from Ms. Burke, we had an additional whereas that is up towards the top that talks about how these services are important. These providers do good work. You know, that way it doesn't come across as a straight up what you're doing is bad. We say it's important work, but we also need to do it in other places. Does that make sense?
That does. Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Burke.
I think this is an important topic. I think it's a really valuable conversation. I think also by adding supportive or affordable units, we're crossing into a different sector that this body hasn't necessarily interacted with, the housing providers, and that I believe a conversation with some of those key sector members is important, because this begins to sort of stretch community safety net essential services out to a new sector. And I think that adding that phrase really brings the conversation into another important policy area.
I might add that a clarifying piece there might be congregate or multi-unit supported housing, right? Because the scattered site units, nobody really knows where they are other than those that hold the mats and have access to the lists. And they aren't the things that are causing the challenges to the neighborhood, because they aren't making these major impacts. But where you point out all of these facilities, and you missed one that is in the neighborhood for sure, those are all of the 40 and 50 and 25 and 30 unit buildings as opposed to the scattered sites. And so you might add some clarifying language there.
Yes, Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you. So I guess I have a question for the drafter and then a question for the authors. So for Dean, I mean, I guess that this isn't actually going into code, so I don't think it sits within some definition section. But how do you define affordable housing unit? Is that a legal term of art, or is it determined by the rent? I mean, for example, in Mr. Peterson, my district, we have many mobile home parks that some people have described as the most effective affordable housing we provide in Anchorage. Is a mobile home considered affordable housing unit, or how do we define it?
Very true. It's not defined in this resolution. I guess we've got the context in which this public policy is being applied in that context. So definition for affordable housing. It maybe have been a little improvident with affordable housing here in this part. I think the main focus was on homeless shelters, transitional. But in terms of a definition, I think that's the best way to say it. It might depend on context.
Yeah. The second question I have for the authors is, I think I certainly support this as a policy and a scattered site, and I think there's pretty good support on the body, but I do think there are some important points here that we need to work through, and I think Ms. Burke also brings up the point about maybe engaging with some community partners. I'm wondering if the authors are willing to put this on the June 12th regular agenda rather than the May 22nd addendum.
That gets to the point of, do we have a public hearing?
Right.
And because if it's introduced as an item for public hearing, it has to be on the 12th, but it needs to go in now. And so that's really one of the functional questions that I think he's asked for help on.
Yeah.
You can complete this line or so. I had a suggestion about language if you guys want to.
Sure.
For you, what I mean. Yeah.
So I think I would like to get in touch with Ms. LaFrance about this, but I think my preference would be to add this to the addendum, set public hearing for the 12th, have public hearing, and then do these processes, talk to the leaders in affordable housing, as Ms. Burke has suggested. So that would be my process. Ms. Wint-Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My point was only a potential suggestion if we're concerned about language precision. Title 21 does define certain types of housing, so it might be something to consider whether what you're really saying is that you want to say that a habilitative care facility or a transitional living facility or things defined in there are the things you actually want to, as opposed to this affordable housing, which I agree is sort of definitionally non-specific.
If I might, the hazard there, of course, is running back down to the rabbit hole of what do they call it, severe alcohol-dependent housing, and how restrictions on that became a big ACLU issue. And rightly, it's a housing issue, and we don't want to probably run down that road and say you can't do that here. But I think there is some care that we can apply to coming up with a definition that is what we need. I just say be really careful about saying you can't do group homes here or supported living environments or, yeah.
And certainly you couldn't say that you couldn't, because the entitlement to do that is governed by Title 21, and the decision on that process is not governed by a policy viewpoint. It is governed by specific process in 21, which again, consider amending, but it does provide some framework for that.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, I have several folks in the queue. So we'll start with Ms. Rose.
So I'm representing the Federation of Community Councils, and one of the things I noticed that this gets to the heart of is I think this really discriminates against the people that are currently downtown and in this area. The services that they need and provided in that area are really important, and access to those services is very important. So I'd like to, I'm going to present this tonight to the Federation of Community Councils. I asked for extra copies. I don't know that everyone received extra copies of the resolution, but I'd like to see this resolution either withdrawn at this time or just reworked so that it doesn't impact them negatively, but encourages, like Nancy also mentioned, going forward in a positive way, getting services elsewhere that still are accessible, that people can actually utilize, and not in a negative light like this resolution does.
Thank you, Ms. Rose. I will let Mr. Constant address that at the end of the queue. I'll go next to Mr. Trainee.
So you're envisioning this public hearing in July and June on this? Okay. So I'll make sure the public will have an opportunity to speak on this. Even though it's just a set policy the administration has to follow. It's important to understand we set policy, but sometimes the administration doesn't tend to listen to us. So we need as a body, if this is going to be the policy we set, we can do it through how we appropriate money, or not appropriate money.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Ms. Burke.
Again, I think I'm very supportive of this concept and of looking at how we can provide access across the community for people. My concern remains that placing housing in what I would like to continue to make the distinction about high volume, unstructured services and their disproportionate impact in certain areas of the town, and structured services in housing where there are proven outcomes. And even in the conversation today, some of the housing units that get lumped into the high volume, unstructured services, I'm encouraging us to not make that comparison. The housing programs we've established that are single site have all very excellent outcomes. There's not emergency calls to those units. They are in locations where there are unstructured, high volume use, and so that concept could be conflated, and I just warned the committee about that.
Thank you, Ms. Burke. Mr. Lampkin.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to answer Forrest's question as best as I can. I work for NeighborWorks Alaska.
We are a multifamily affordable housing company. Our mission is affordable housing. Typically for us, affordable housing means that we'll keep a certain percentage below market rate. So it may be 10, 15% below market rate. And those housing units will probably may come with subsidies. Alaska Housing Vouchers, BASH program for veterans. I would offer or like NeighborWorks to be at that conversation, along with probably Cook Inlet and Rural Cap. And I also would offer a tour to the assembly to one of our mission units on 9th and Barrow, which is strictly for homelessness. It's 84 units, and it's has a waiting list to get in. But if you drove past it, you wouldn't even realize that this particular property is just for homeless people. That's the only way you can get in. So that's my point. If you have any questions for us, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Lampkin. Mr. Constant.
Thanks. You wouldn't realize it unless you lived by it, and people who live by it know, and people who live in the downtown recognize that the massive majority of these facilities are located here, the massive majority, not a simple majority. Now, to the point of we should take this off because the services are there because it's convenient. Again, the history lesson. We have the system that we have now because of racist policy from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. We changed the rules and we took away the right to enforce legal discrimination, but it became de facto discrimination. And the discriminatory policies we have now, we have neighborhoods outside of Anchorage driving all of their poverty, all of their suffering, and all of their sickness into one part of town. In fact, 20 years ago, when Mr. Wolforth sat in the seat I'm in, they passed a law that said those facilities have to be downtown. We're now undoing the racist policy of the past, the discriminatory policy of the past. And it's fine that this is introduced and we have this debate, because I'm going to continue to let people know that redlining is over, steering is over, and we need to equitably distribute these services across this municipality. Now, I didn't author this thing, and I'm grateful for the people who did. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As to the intent of this resolution, for me, it is about recognizing the challenges that people living in East Downtown and Fairview face, coexisting with many of these support services, shelters, and balancing those needs of the community with the needs of homeless folks as well. Certainly, if there is a possibility for unintended consequences, with the language, the timeline for addressing that and preventing any of those, I fully support, because I think we definitely want to have people involved in that conversation. And I would also stress that the intent is not to discriminate against anybody, but to very honestly ask ourselves as a community, how are we going to address these issues? If we keep doing what we're doing, we will keep getting what we're getting, and we have some problems that we need to sit at the table and honestly address by changing policy or ordinance, and balance those needs of different folks and be very honest about what's working and what might not be working. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, thank you. Respectfully, Mr. Chair, beware, you're headed into a buzzsaw. You're familiar with NIMBY? Then there's banana. Build absolutely nothing near anything. And the next one out is no, not on planet Earth. So I would encourage you to go slow and think about adding some language here that'll let housing communities believe that we're not going to impact their neighborhoods and so on. And when you think about remote, dispersed places, you're not going to get most of the social services we need to be there. And if you do and I also respect your goal here, if you do get some reasonable dispersed camping spots, if you will, then we probably need to go out of our way to provide buses from there to where the services are. But I would encourage you to go a couple of months out and do your homework in the meantime. Mr. Dunbar, your earlier question about how do you get the administration to do what you want, resolutions are almost toothless. Which is exactly right, the way we can say what we think. But on a state level, I not only saw the state ignore the will of the legislature, I saw them ignore their own statutes. We finally got teeth in it by putting individual personnel employment numbers in the statute, that those were going away when the schedule wasn't met. But it's just a very difficult thing, the separation of powers. The only other thing you've got is we have standing to go in court, a civil court.
Our attorney works for the administration.
No, our
Thank
attorney
you,
works for
Mr.
both of us, sir. Administration and the executive branch. She serves both.
That is correct.
All right, Mr. Trainee.
Fred, you forgot CAVE also, Citizens Against Virtually Everything. That's the other group we have out there.
No, you just taught me something.
We need to make a list of these.
But we've done that before. You said the position number, that somebody's actually taken position numbers away
Yep.
to change the direction of administration, and we can do it again.
A remarkable impact on behavior.
Oh, it does. It gets their attention in a hurry.
And I just might add, my sense of this administration is they're engaged in dealing with this problem. They're really into it. But I see from Nancy some real wisdom about what doesn't work. All the trails that don't work, darn it. But this administration also seems to me to deal with me with passive aggressive behavior and pats on the head at times. And I suspect some of your good ideas will go in the same rat hole as mine have.
One last thing, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, Mr.
Fred,
Trainee.
we have to keep in mind that administrations come, administrations go. We may like this administration, but that doesn't mean in 3 years we'll have the same administration.
All
We've got to
right.
look long-term at this, not just who the administration is currently.
Thank you. Any final comments on this? Yes,
Yeah,
Mr. Constant.
to the point that what we're doing is good for the individuals who are experiencing homelessness in the north of town because the services are there. When you walk through the environment that they're living in the woods, covered in fecal matter, heroin needles lumped all through the woods, tons of trash piled up, that's a really amazing form of denial that an individual can have to, or a community can have to tell themselves that that's good what we're doing. We need to do more of that. And so we need to break through this denial. And to that end, I know I have some neighbors here who are wanting to talk about that denial and what it looks like in real time to people who live in it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I will be opening up audience participation after I get any final comments. So do we have any final comments? Okay, great. So we actually have time during this meeting to have audience participation. So we'll have 3 minutes, and if you could just give us your first and last name for the record and which part of town you live in. Let's go ahead and Mr. Oliva.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera.
What part of town you live
I
in?
speak for all of you, as your fellow human beings and citizens.
Chewing a thumb.
First of all, my name is Ron Oliva, a 44-year resident and adjacent property owner to the Brother Francis Shelter, and at the nucleus of not a homeless problem, but, and I got these words from a fireman and someone who worked at the soup kitchen. We have an infestation of feral human beings, and they behave like vermin. And that's what your challenge is to deal with that. Those words are harsh, but they're accurate. And they're a threat to all of us in the community, our safety, our health, economic interference in the quiet enjoyment of our parks, bike paths, and our residences. What you produce is mostly this paperwork that I think Lisa Sauter needs toilet paper, because we've been down that road. And the verbal diarrhea that I get out of politicians is sanctimonious hypocrisy, which led to my second lawsuit. It's my second one. And it hurts me inside because I helped start the shelter. I did that. And it's lost its way. It's lost its mission. And the soup kitchen, I want GuideStar to publish all the salaries. We know her salary at $187,000, rumored $145,000 and $40,000 in benefits with a car. Are we getting the bang for our buck? Well, listen, they're not going to come forward. So now I wanted to sue by myself because I didn't want to shame the rest of the people who have to say they sued a homeless shelter, sued a soup kitchen, and sued themselves as a taxpayer in this municipality. But I've been approached by other members of the community to join in a class action. And we're going to go down that route because the $30,000 I won on the first lawsuit, nothing. I offered it back to the assembly. Dick, you were there. Get a security guard, get commercial garbage pickup, get a medic. And guess who showed up? Nobody. And I'm still suffering. And unfortunately, my health has been taken away because of the stress, the fear of having those tents surround me like a fishbowl. It's like having a gun pointed at your head. And I can't take it anymore. I'm going to take a dirt mat. So we're going to go with the class action. It'll take 4 years. We already have $100,000 to back us. And the city's going to pay. They're going to pay, and you are partners and complicit with the Brother Francis Shelter in Beans for creating the problem. You fed them, bred them, you clothed them, and you coddled them.
If you can wrap up, Mr. Oliva, your time is up.
Long-term enabling got you where you were today. And it got those 2 security guards here, too. They're friends. I told them no mace because I have an eye infection.
Thank you, Mr. Oliva.
Felix, solve this problem. You'll never end homelessness. You've got to manage it. And there's no housing first because it's so complex. You've got to attack it from every direction. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Okay, the Pope said to have a little humor. I wish I had a little, but I do have a sense of humor.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to testify? Yes.
My name is Larry Michael. I live in South Addition. I own Arctic Hawks Inn Bed and Breakfast on East 2nd Court in Cordova. And this is my first time to be here. It's been very interesting and educational, it has to be. I think what, for me, has been a little absent is that, of course, there's desire to do well by homeless. I was part of the cleanup. I was actually having barbecue duties, but I was part of the cleanup that went down. And it is our strong desire to do right for our community to help clean it up. We do have an inordinate amount of concentration of difficulties in our area. And it's amazing to me that that camp was allowed to be there for well over a year. And there are many variations of that. It's unfortunate that some conflict went down, that our attempt to notify numerous people about what we were doing was somehow misunderstood or miscommunicated, but it was our desire to do well by our community and to get it cleaned up. From that base camp and others, there's a lot going on down that East 3rd corridor with bus stop benches. And in front of my business, I talked to an observer who saw numerous people coming out of the Housing First building, getting spice from somebody who is well known by name. I know the guy's name. She also observed someone shooting up on that bus stop bench. she also witnessed somebody getting it on. I was notified by the housing director at Rural Cap that we need to contact Crime Stoppers, we need to contact the police, but the police aren't doing anything. So here I am at the beginning of tourism season with a bed and breakfast that's been very successful, and my numbers are down. I am collecting evidence now from people that are saying, I'll have to cancel, I don't like that. I have 2 pieces now early in the season. I will continue to collect that. It's just discouraging. So whatever efforts there are, this is a community-wide problem. And for all those acronyms, I hope our community is good enough to find community-wide solutions. It's not just where the services are. The services can be multiple places. We're smarter to bring services to many areas in Anchorage.
Thank you. I think Mr. Constant has a quick question.
Larry, I'm gonna hate to do this to you, but request that you attend the FCC meeting that is this week, the Federation of Community Councils.
It's tonight, sir.
Tonight.
6 o'clock.
And you too, Ms. Rhodes, because it's clear there's an advocate that's gonna go and say that these services need to stay downtown, and I need help getting the message out there that we need to be fair and equitable across this community.
And there are good people everywhere in Alaska.
Right.
Or in Anchorage.
Please go to that meeting too, because we need to have a voice there.
All right. Would anyone else like to speak? Yes.
May I speak from here? I think
Sure.
you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
My name is Stephanie Rose, and I'm a South Addition resident. And I spoke to you last October and December about fires and other hazards on the Chester Creek Trail. And I'm not going to repeat what you've already heard about these settlements. They are truly disgusting. Most of you know that I've devoted my professional life to assisting people who are homeless and co-occurring substance and abusers and people with serious mental illness to find housing. And I agree with our last person who talked about the fact that we're all here because we care about the plight of people who are homeless in our community. The situation, though, on the Chester Creek Trail is that the folks who are living there really are not involuntarily homeless people. These are folks, and I don't think it's been discussed, and I had intended to speak at the public safety meeting, because this is a situation where people have essentially homesteaded our trails, and they've created large settlements, and they are full of bike parts that have been stolen from adjacent neighbors, propane tanks and other items, literally everything you can imagine, from Keurig coffee makers to Dell computers. It is an amazing situation, and this is not the demographic of people that I spent my professional life assisting. So one of the things I guess I want to say is that while I appreciate that y'all don't want to see things, concentrated in one area, and this is a thing of concern, the truth is that there are people in this town that are basically criminal thinking, voluntarily homesteading our greenbelt. And those people simply have to be abated. And you are trying to take the whole micro or macrocosm of homelessness and keep that group in the Venn diagram. And they need a different treatment. They simply aren't the folks that we are all willing to help and to help clean up and to help get to social services. I gotta urge that you see them differently and that you treat that problem differently. The money now that it will cost to drag off the tons and tons, and my heart goes out to you, sir, of human waste and decay and stolen property is so big that every second we sit here talking about a resolution to do something, the failure to act is costing the municipality more and more money right now. So that is what I hope you will concentrate on, is that component of our community that basically has taken over. Thank you.
Thank you. I have 2 questions for you. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah. I hope you all realize that Stephanie Rose is the patron saint of the therapeutic courts and has done a marvelous job. She's tough love and personified. Stephanie, can you comment a bit on a legal remedy where we can immediately remove trespassers, let's say on the bike trail or in the immediate vicinity?
How do you define
Well, sir, I'm not here to give you legal advice, because I did retire, and I'm happy about it. I'm going to leave that to them, but I will tell you one thing that they skipped over in their advice to do, which is this. The reason you need 10 days is because you don't want to inventory and store the property. And the deal is that the failure to want to simply inventory and store property immediately and move people toward the shelters and toward other opportunities for transitional housing, which are available in the community. They're certainly available for reentrance from jail at this point. The failure to not want to do that, to spend that money and put aside that property to put that stuff in so people can come and get it, means that you are going to spend on the back end millions of dollars cleaning that crap up.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Trainee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just got an email relative to this Chester Creek from Veronica. She's a member of our constituents. She says her last comment is, if the municipality does nothing, our vigilantes will. And the problem is, Anchorage Public is getting tired of nothing being done. And I'm concerned that she's foretelling the future, because vigilantes will start working this problem if we don't. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. All right, do we have anyone else that would like to speak? Yes, sir, in the front. Sure, go ahead.
I live here in Anchorage. I have a question. Do you have a representative from the homeless people coming to these meetings and being a part of it for solutions? And if you have money, maybe you can pay that person. That person can get self-esteem and can grow. Something to think about.
Thank you. You can address.
Yes, ma'am. 1 year ago, I proposed that we create a community council of homeless people, a body that would be of people who have experienced recently homelessness, but who could speak on behalf of people who are homeless, not as a voice of their paid advocates, the shelter providers, or those who have an interest in some governmental function, but on behalf of those individuals who experience homelessness. And I have in June someone coming up to help me map out a way to create an advocacy system, a self-advocacy system for homeless people to do just what you said, because I believe the one voice that's missing in all of these conversations is the voice of people who either have come out of that universe or who are in it but living in it in a way that isn't destructive to the whole environment around them. So I thank you for being here and sharing your voice, and I'm working on it.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Go ahead, sir, in the front. You will be our last testifier.
Okay. I want to follow up on a couple of questions regarding the legal issue. My name is Russ Webb. I'm a resident of South Addition. I'm also Stephanie Rhodes' husband. I'm going to follow up on a couple of things. I am not an attorney, so I'm happy to render a legal opinion related to legality. My understanding is that the settlement that this community entered into allows us to immediately abate camps if we do, as Stephanie indicated, which is to protect, secure, and store personal property, allowing for the retrieval of that property by the owners. We've chosen as a community not to employ that, as I understand it, because it's expensive. We've said that it's expensive, it takes police officers, it's time consuming, whatever. So that's a policy choice we've made. The issue of illegal camping, or frankly homesteading in the Chester Creek area, and I think in other areas on public land, is not the issue of homelessness. It's not the traditional population. It's not the same. Our community has a multifaceted problem, and we have to address it with multifaceted solutions. One size does not fit all. Some camps are small, temporary, and occupied by persons in poverty or with disabilities and other needs. Some are more persistent, but also occupied by the truly homeless. Others are massive, near-permanent camps with accumulations of waste property and occupied by younger, physically and mentally capable persons who are choosing to occupy public land near neighborhoods to provide opportunities for criminal activity that supports their lifestyle. And that's what I see when I walk Chester Creek Trail regularly. And I walk into the camp and take pictures, and I'm happy to provide pictures. And I, as including yesterday, had conversations with the occupants that I could find. We've chosen to allow the development of these enormous near-permanent camps and massive accumulations of human waste, needles, property, open fires, which endanger not only the campers themselves, but the citizens who try also to use the public lands. It's the issue that we are trying to bring forward is not a NIMBY issue, a banana issue, or a cave issue. It's everywhere. We have to begin to employ public policies that prevent the kind of development, so that we're working on and putting our resources on the front end, at least some of those problems, and not on the back end where the effort involved is enormous and unbelievably costly.
Thank you, sir. I have a question for you, Mr. Dunbar.
Actually, it's a question for Mr. Rada, if he's here. I'd like to ask it of APD as well, but I don't believe they have anyone here yet. And I'm sure they will at the next meeting. They're out in the hallway. So, it's kind of like squeezing air in a balloon. We have a variety of camps, some in East Anchorage, a lot downtown, some in South Anchorage now. But what the last two testifiers were talking about is some very large, very persistent camp in Chester Creek. I assume that we've noticed it, and again, APD's not here, but noticed it in the legal sense. Why aren't we abating that particular camp? If there are kind of unique camps that are full of unique kinds of occupants, why haven't we been able to abate those particular camps?
Not the easiest question to answer, because the list is extremely long, and the priorities as established or requested or conveyed to us multiple, and our resources are very slim. So we work as fast as we can to finish one area as opposed to not finishing an area and then move on to another area and leave one undone and move to the Third Avenue area, which is still incomplete, as well as take care of the daily occurrences that come to our attention, either in neighborhoods, in rights-of-way, or other locations, because it never ends. On top of that, we get some other requests from the community to assist with other forms of moving an office, helping at Sullivan Arena, coming to some other location to do something else that's also needed in the community. So community work service, while it employs very few and it's reliant on the court participants, and that could be one a day, it could be 8 or 9 in a day. We never know. So as fast as we can mobilize and address an area, we try to complete that, abate it if you will. And in the meantime, when somebody else says, well, we've got, for example, yesterday, the camps that were along the 3rd and Ingram, bluffed by the ANS site, have now moved, and its place was probably a 6 to 8 foot tall by 10 by 10 area of stuff that had been left for us to pick up. So we add these things as we go. It's a challenge to stay on top of everything that we're supposed to do. And there are so many others that are on that list. We have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow to talk about prioritization and how we're going to look at this maybe in a more effective way. And as soon as the other personnel that the Assembly funded last fall come on board, which is the first week of June, then you're gonna see a much more active, aggressive, and cumulative positive effect. But in the meantime, we're going as fast as we can, as hard as we can, with the resources we have, to take care of many problems as we're out.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Okay, Mr. Trainee.
One quick thing, as we talk about storing the evidence, we talked to the police department, they need a couple of things from us. They don't have the capacity to do it. We're going to have to get them another building for evidence storage and clerks to store the evidence. That's the main stopgap from us doing it right now, is collecting this evidence and storing it. Because we don't have the capacity. So as we get into whatever quarter budget revision we're going to do, we have got to put money for the police department to evidence clerks and to a building so they can store the evidence. Because right now it's full. So it's easy for us to say, just close the cache and store the stuff. But where are you storing? We need to give the police department those assets to make this happen.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Trainee. With that, this meeting is adjourned.